Hi everyone. So this is going to be the first in a four-part series on how to lesson plan. And before we get into what mastery objectives are, how to really work up some activities, and how all this fits together, I want to really talk about the parts of a lesson plan first. So we're going to start with the most basic of lesson plans. The most basic lesson plans have mastery objectives, which we're going to cover in segment 2. An opening, which in New York we call a do now, but in other places this might be a warm-up, or in Pennsylvania it was called an anticipatory set. Then you have your learning activities, and this is going to follow many different models. This could look different in for each lesson plan, but really this is where the students have already activated their prior knowledge with the do now, and this is where we want students to be doing activities that are going to help them master whatever we want them to get out of this lesson. After our learning activities, we definitely want a closing. And this closing is about 5 to 10 minutes long. And what this closure does is it wraps up the lesson so there's some kind of finality for the students. But it also allows us as teachers to get a sense of how much they actually learned, how close they are to really mastering whatever objectives that we set for them for that day. So I'll give you an example. Say I wanted students to be able to recall 3 of the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. I might give them an exit slip before they leave and say, I want you to write maybe as many of the freedoms as you can possibly list. I know that I want them to definitely walk out with 3 out of 5. 5 out of 5 would be the best, but definitely at least 3 out of 5. I can then take that data and I can see which ones students remembered, which ones students were often forgetting, and then how many students actually knew all 5, 4 out of 5, 3 out of 5, and so on. So this closure is more than just, kind of saying, oh, this is what we did today and this is what we're going to do tomorrow. It's really, this is our time to formatively assess students. And finally, we have an evaluation. Now, when we're doing mock lesson plans, like we do so often at the college level before you actually get out and do some teaching, this evaluation doesn't matter so much. But when you're teaching and you're going to be using this lesson plan again, it's really important to evaluate how that lesson went and how your students did so that you can adjust that lesson for the next time. This evaluation piece is going to be kind of on the fly if you're teaching more than one class in a day. So if I taught my first period class and I noticed that most students were only getting 2 out of 5 of the first, the freedoms in the First Amendment, maybe I'd need to change my lesson plan right then and there. If they're getting 3 out of 5, maybe I need to think about how I can adjust these learning activities here to really get them to that 5 out of 5 level. So these are the 5 major lesson plan components. But that's not all a lesson plan is. So let's take a look at actually a pretty poor example of a lesson plan, because I think that's going to help us understand a little bit about what our lesson plan needs to look like. So let me just pull up my pencil here so I can make some notes as we're going along. And we're going to walk through this lesson plan together. So you notice at the very top, she gives us the subject, which we know is government, and who we are teaching this to, what grade level. More importantly, you might want to also add IEPs, so who are those students with disabilities, and 504s. And when you get to your special education classes, that's going to become really important. This student started off with objectives. Now this is interesting because really what we should be basing all of our lessons on are the standards. So this was when I taught in Pennsylvania. So the standard that she says, how this lesson as a whole connects with what Pennsylvania wants the students to learn. They're supposed to be able to analyze how participation in civic and political life, notice those are different here, leads to attainment of individual and public goals. Now I'm going to tell you right now, she doesn't do this. And that's a problem. How do I know she doesn't do it? Because I can look back up at her objectives. So let's take a look at this. Students will be able to, so by the end of class, students will be able to recognize the setbacks of literacy tests by attempting to take a literacy test and watching a video clip about the start of civil rights. That really doesn't fully connect with this standard here. The next one, students will be able to identify the steps needed to take in order to apply for voter registration by examining the Pennsylvania voter registration website and information. That might lead more into this participation aspect, so that might be a bit of a connection, but this one definitely isn't. So what you need to do is put your standard, these standards should have been up here because that's what we begin with. But really take a look at your professional standards. So if you're social studies, you'd want to look at for the state social studies standards, which she did here, or math or English or science or elementary ed. You also, though, and something she didn't do either, is look at the CEC standards, the Council for Exceptional Children. Now, the Council for Exceptional Children is kind of the umbrella organization for special education. So when we talk about later on how we accommodate students, how we help all students learn, those are the standards we're going to go to. And because this was written before Common Core, we also want to look at how we are helping meet the Common Core standards. Even if we're not teaching a math or an English class, we all are math and reading teachers in some way. So let's move on. So she has these objectives here. She also has resources and materials so that when she's getting prepared, she knows what she needs. And then she has the anticipatory set. Remember, in New York, we're going to call this a do now. And a do now should be 5 to 10 minutes. And it should do two things. It should, one, kind of get students into the lesson, activate that prior knowledge. And two, it also acts as a kind of almost a pre-test. You're trying to figure out, what do the students know? If the students already know all these objectives, this lesson doesn't really make any sense to teach, right? So she goes through and she asks for volunteers and she plays a little game. What's interesting here is that in her, she starts with vocabulary words, which is great. The history word of the day, which I'm not sure is really relevant for a government class. But she says she's going to play a game here, a scenario question game called Who Can Vote? But she never explains really what that means. So here in this do now, I'd like to see her elaborate just a little bit about what she's going to do. And then down here, after she explains the game, I'd also like to see possible student answers. What does she hope to get out of this? What does she hope students are going to answer? Because if we can't anticipate students' answers, we don't know how to create good questions. Then she goes into her procedures, which are our learning activities. And notice how she elaborates, but she also bullet points. This is really helpful for using your lesson plan when you teach. You can write big, long paragraphs, but that's not going to help you quickly identify where you are and keep going. Make sure, though, again, that you provide possible student answers and the precursor to that, questions you'll ask. Because if you don't know what questions you'll ask and what answers you expect, you're not going to be able to scaffold those students' learning. Finally, she has her closure. And she says, after the end of the lecture, I will readdress the questions I posed at the beginning of class. I'm assuming what she meant by that are these scenarios, but she doesn't make that really clear, and I don't know what readdress means in her mind because she doesn't give me an example. She goes on to say, as a class, we will correct any wrong answers and discuss each answer. If time permits, I will go over some of the answers to today's interactive worksheet. Again, I have no idea what that is. But remember I said the closure should link to the mastery objectives, right? So let's go up and let's make sure that these scenarios are what students are actually supposed to learn. She said that they're going to recognize the setbacks of literacy tests, which was in her activities but not in that closure, by attempting to take a literacy test and watch a video. She doesn't do that. She will have no idea if students actually learned this. The next one is identify the steps needed to take in order to apply for voter registration. Again, at no point does she assess this. So what she says students should know and be able to do, she never tests out at the end. So this closure is really pretty useless because it doesn't tell us what we said at the beginning we needed to know. A better closure might have actually been for students to maybe list the steps for applying for voter registration, and or maybe have them write a sentence or two about how literacy tests impacted the civil rights movement, or the civil rights movement impacted literacy tests, whichever one she wanted to go with. Okay. She has a homework section, which is great, but you don't necessarily need it. But interestingly enough, what she doesn't have is any accommodations. I don't know how she's going to help all students learn here. So for example, maybe in this lesson plan she has them watch a video clip. So maybe an accommodation might be a worksheet where students fill in answers to help those students who have some issues concentrating know what they actually need to get out of this video clip. She never really explains that up there. That might be a good accommodation that we would also link to our CEC standards here. Okay. And finally, for evaluation, she doesn't really tell, she uses evaluation as a way to assess. She probably wanted to call this the assessment section, which is very important. Again, knowing what students actually learned. And this evaluation section really isn't useful here because she talks about assessment instead of evaluation. Notice in all of this that whatever you say your objectives are really need to be taught throughout these procedures and assessed at the end in the closure. We need to know that students actually learn something from our lesson. And those are the parts of a good lesson plan.